Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a very special privilege to welcome to our program today the Honorable James A. McClure, the junior United States Senator from the state of Idaho. Senator McClure graduated from the University of Idaho Law School in 1950. Upon completing that degree, he returned to his hometown of Payette, Idaho, where he practiced law. He is the former city attorney and also the prosecuting attorney of that area. He served in the state Senate for 3 terms, and while in the Senate, was the Idaho State Senate Assistant Majority Leader. He was elected to the 90th, 91st, and 92nd Congresses as a member of the House of Representatives. In 1972, he was elected to the United States Senate and has served in that capacity from that time until now. He is married with 3 children. As to committee assignments in the U.S. Senate, he serves on the Budget, the Energy and Natural Resources, the Environment and Public Works, and the Joint Economic Committees. Senator McClure, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on our program.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be back.
Joining this evening in questioning our guests will be 3 panel members. First is Mr. Bob Brown, who is the Director of the Placement Center for the North Idaho College Vocational Programs. Bob, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
Also, Mrs. Beverly Bemis, who is a member of the North Idaho College Board of Trustees, will be joining in the questioning. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you.
And third will be Barry Schuler, who is the president of North Idaho College. Welcome, Barry. We'll proceed to questions, and the first series this evening will come from Mr. Bob Brown.
Senator, there's been quite a controversy, of course, in Idaho with the gospel hump area. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on the proposed compromises they're talking about now. How do you feel about this? Do you think this will answer the questions, or?
Well, it answers some of the questions. It doesn't answer all of them. It's a very, very tough issue, how we allocate resources and to what uses and who is advantaged and who is disadvantaged. The problem now in the compromise seems to me is that the timber industry in Grangeville has really no options. They must enter into this compromise or die. And the result is they've, at least segments of the industry, those that are most directly threatened by closure, have been willing to make larger concessions than they otherwise would have been willing to make. And secondly, the compromise was forged between that timber interest and the wilderness interests on the other side. Other people who have other interests were not represented in the negotiations. The mining industry was invited to participate. They did not participate at that time, leaving it to the later stages of the negotiation to get involved. But the largest group that was not represented and is most unhappy about the result are those who use the area for recreation. And these are represented by the snowmobilers, the four-wheel drive clubs, and the people who want to go in there not to use the resource in an exploitative way, not to remove timber or minerals, but to go in and enjoy and to use the area. And they feel that they've been excluded. So it's a difficult question. It's an area that has been used very intensively by these groups. As they say, you took the area away to the east of us. That's in the Lochsaw, Selway, Bitterroot, primitive and wilderness areas. Then you took away the high alpine areas southwest of us in the Seven Devils in the Hells Canyon recreation area. Now you're going to take away the only remaining high alpine area in central Idaho. And so it's a tough, bitter issue. And I hope we can make some accommodations that go a little further than the original compromise. And I regard that original compromise not as the end of the process, but at the beginning of the process for public involvement. And I've not been critical of the fact that they sat down and negotiated an agreement, but I would be critical if that is then locked in concrete so it can't be changed. I think the rest of the public is entitled to be heard, and I think their views ought to be considered before the final agreement is reached.
Beverly Bemis.
Senator McClure, our area is always concerned with the forest product industry, and your knowledge and rational approach to their problems is appreciated. What do you see as the future for the forest products industry? If efforts were not restricted, if the industry were allowed to develop the full potential of this renewable resource, could not the United States supply a large portion of the world's demand for wood fiber and help the balance of trade?
Well, certainly, as you know, we're importing a great deal of wood products from outside the United States now. At the same time we do, along the western coast, export some to Japan and the Far East. I think the timber industry has a larger potential than is being met now, because, and that's masked here in the West because nearly all of that which we see in Idaho is based upon either federal or state lands. Some large timber companies own private lands and utilize the timber on them, but there's an awful lot of private woodlots and small ownerships that are really not very well organized, and they don't produce very well. But the federal forest lands are the ones that are our most critical asset, because they are not being managed at all well, in my judgment. Not all the fault of the Forest Service. Congress simply won't put the money behind the management that's necessary. And secondly, I think they misuse some of their money. I think they build too many roads to too high a standard, and they waste a lot of the money. But certainly, we don't have enough timber base in the United States now to meet the building demands of our own citizens. If we were able to get the housing starts up to 2 million per year and hold it there, we would run into a timber shortage in less than 3 years under current conditions. We must, as a matter of fact, just absolutely must, break this logjam of the de facto wilderness areas and make some resolution of what's going to happen there, so that we can begin the job of intensive management of those areas which will be released for commercial forest land.
Barry Schuler.
Senator Jim, how do you evaluate the economic philosophy, and perhaps I should say the overall economic policies of the Carter administration that have emerged during the past 9 months?
Well, I'm not really certain yet what those economic philosophies are. I know that the president wants to reach a balanced budget by 1981, or he says now 1982, and then he says maybe by reasonable balance. It's kind of a shifting target. It's been changing a little as realism sets in, because I think most economists will agree he's not going to get there from here under the policies being adopted by the administration. It's too optimistic to assume that everything that will come out in the best possible way, and even the most optimistic assumptions say that that's what would have to happen to reach the goals he's set. I go a step further than that. I don't agree with the basic economic philosophy that's involved, because I think there are a number of things that have been disproven. For instance, there's been the tacit understanding that if you want unemployment down, you have to accept a rate of inflation. On the other hand, if you want inflation down, then you have to accept a relatively higher level of unemployment. There is built into all the econometric models the things that economists like to play with in computers, the basic assumption of the Phillips curve, that there is this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. When we recently saw both inflation and unemployment rise together, and then saw unemployment and inflation both go down together, the economists are totally perplexed. That doesn't fit the model. And so you ask them, how does that happen? They say, well, I don't know. And then you ask, well, why, if you don't know, do you persist in projecting all the rest of the economic theory for the next few years on the same assumptions? Well, because that's the way it works. Well, it doesn't work that way. Recent history has demonstrated that it doesn't work that way. But I think the Carter administration and the Carter administration figures have been following the old theory, as though it is immutable, as though it fits the rigidity of a mathematical formula. It has the certainty of people responding exactly as numbers in a formula do, and it simply doesn't work. Beyond that, I think, too, that you will see hidden in the President's energy package two primary motivations, one of which is pure economics. They want to raise taxes without telling people they're raising them. They want to generate more revenue so they can spend more revenue at government level without telling people they've raised taxes. And so a large part of the impetus in the energy package is simply that desire to have more money for government to spend.
Senator McClure, another issue before the Congress this year, in fact, it was a heated enough issue that it resulted in a filibuster for some time in the Senate, and that is dealing with election laws. And I would like to address a question to you that's two-part. First, concerning congressional financing of campaigns and what's your position on that. And secondly, what is the status of the no voter registration bill and your position on that?
Well, the election law changes have been dramatic over the last several years. They've really shifted the power in this country and the way in which it's used in elections. I'm not sure that it's sanitized the elections. It's brought some of it out in the open a little bit more than it was before, and I favor disclosure. I think that's right. I think the people ought to be able to see what influences are brought to bear. But while it has depressed certain elements of political influence, it's enhanced the power of other groups. For instance, we had the experience of financing the presidential election last time. One group that was almost totally unaffected by that was organized labor. These laws have been written to favor the AFL-CIO. The result was they spent almost as much money outside the campaign limitations as the presidential candidates did within. And that gives them a tremendous economic, political clout in our country that's far and away the most cogent political force in the United States today. They're organized, they're well-financed, they know what they're doing, and they have almost no restrictions on their political activity, unlike almost all other political groups. As far as congressional campaign financing is concerned, should it be paid for by the taxpayers? I don't think so. I think the ability of a candidate to project himself or herself to the potential voters and potential contributors is as important a part of the political process as the vote itself. If a person cannot raise the money to run, then perhaps they're not a viable candidate. If they can raise the money, they're going to be able to. I think, again, however, that ought to be done in the open. It ought to be done with those contributions public. I think you run into problems when you get down to publishing the lists of very small contributions because they become almost meaningless. They become so voluminous, kind of like the reporting procedure we had on the sales of .22 ammunition a few years ago. They filled rooms with the report forms, and the volume of the report itself meant it was meaningless because you couldn't sit through it and find anything out from it. But I do think that the major contributors have been required to be and will be required to be under the law to be reported, and I think the other financial parts, and there's several parts, the contribution side and the expenditure side, ought to be published, and they will be. But I am not in favor of the taxpayers having to pick up the burden of financing the campaign. We were very much criticized, the Congress was. I voted against the pay raise for Congress, but Congress as a whole was very much criticized for that pay raise. And then Congress turns right around and says, but now we want you to pay for our elections. And that doesn't seem to me to comport with what the public wants.
In part two, I know that history has recorded in this country, in some sections of southern states in particular, there have been charges of irregularities in elections, and records appear to be important, such as voter registration lists. Do you perceive any danger of not having any registration at all in conducting open and fair elections?
Well, thank you, and I forgot to answer that question. I'm glad you reminded me. I am not for the instant registration because I think it is subject to fraud. We saw some areas in the country last time where they had relatively instant registration under state law, where people moved from one area to another, in one instance, one state to another, because they're right on the state line, and voted in numbers enough to change the results, or at least to affect the results in those areas. I think instant registration just leads to an almost impossible enforcement problem. I just don't think it's possible to cope with that problem. We in Idaho have looked at it quite differently over the years because we've had very, very open election processes in Idaho. People were welcome to register. We were one of the first states in the nation to recognize the mobility question, that people who moved in recently should be able to vote for the President of the United States. But at the same time, we said, you may not know enough about local candidates and local politics to be an informed voter. And after all, that's what we're after. Not just masses of people, but people who are informed about the issues and the candidates who will vote, and vote intelligently. And I think the instant voter registration is dead for at least this year, I'm certain of that, and perhaps for next year too. And I am very much opposed to it. But I am opposed on a more fundamental ground than those I've discussed. And that is that it seems to me the constitutional provision that says that the state shall be the judge of the qualification of the electors is still the provision of the Constitution that ought to control. I think the states have the right to make that decision so long as it's done in a way which is not calculated to keep people from voting who ought to be entitled to vote.
Bob Brown.
Senator Juanita Krebs, the Secretary of the Commerce, sent up a trial balloon recently concerning raising the retirement age to 68, and there was quite an outcry raised against this. And now, I believe it was within the last week, the Republican caucus has issued a similar type of proposal. Would you like to comment on that and how you feel about it?
Well, we established both permissive and mandatory retirement ages at a period in our history quite different from now. First of all, people at age 65 were really, as a matter of fact, their life expectancy was very low back in the mid-1930s. Our longevity, our life expectancy has changed dramatically. And the result is you've got people who are, by those old rules, being under retirement, whether they wish to be or not, for a great many years, when 35, 40 years ago would have been just a few years. I saw the figure just recently. A baby girl being born today has a life expectancy of over 81 years. Well, that means, if that's true, that the average young woman growing up can expect to be put on the shelf for at least 16 to 18 years of her life. Can we afford to do that as a society? And then beyond that, should we say to people, you must? You have no value to us anymore. You're 65 years old, set you aside, you're no longer a productive member of society. And I think that's wrong. So I think we ought to be rethinking the entire relationship between the productivity of our citizens, their opportunity for labor, the way in which they maintain a standard of living of their own choice and within the capacity of their ability, in conjunction with both mandatory and permissive retirement systems. I think there is a growing recognition that this problem is a real problem for a great many people in our society. They don't want to retire. They want to remain productive. We've passed legislation that says you can't discriminate against them on the basis of their age, and then we pass another law that says, except if you're over 65, then you must be discriminated against. And that strikes me as being basically unfair. We've been doing quite a lot of work on unemployment, the statistics, the way you measure the phenomena that underlie the social phenomenon. And it seems to me that one thing must be recognized, that we demand of our people that they be totally employable or not employed at all. The young people entering the mainstream, if they're not fully employable, they find it very difficult to get a job. They're excluded, and that's why we have such tremendously high rates of unemployment among young people under 25. We do the same thing to those with learning disabilities, the partially able, the less than fully employable, and we do the same thing to our older people. You must stay on the job at full employment or you're worthless to us, is what our law is saying. And I just don't think that's a just or fair thing to do to our elder citizens.
I wonder if I could just pursue one more point. There are, of course, many people who wish to retire at 65 and can do so under the proposed plan. Now, the people that would like to retire at 65 but feel they can't do it on reduced benefits, now how will your proposal, yours, the Congress, deal with this problem? There are many, many people who, at 62 now, will not retire because they cannot afford the reduced payments for the rest of their life, so they will work on 3 additional years when they would prefer to retire at 62. Does your plan have any provisions for this?
There are a whole different host of variations on the theme of where do you get full benefits, where do you get reduced benefits. But let's face one fact, you can get no more out of a system than that which is paid into it. So you increase the benefits or make it possible for people to retire earlier, then you either give them less money or there's less money for everybody else that draws from the system. And the Social Security system is plagued with that trouble right now. It's paying out more than comes in. It will be bankrupt by 1981 if we don't do something about it. I think we should have done something about it last year or the year before, and we're not going to do anything about it this year. I hope we'll have the courage to do something about it next year, because it is a serious problem that won't go away. But you can't increase the benefits without increasing income. And if you don't increase the taxes that flow into the system, then if you increase the benefits for any given segment, that means that all the others who are under the system have a little bit lower benefits. So if you have early retirement, it seems to me it has to be on the basis of a reduced amount of payment. Now, if that's not enough money to live on fully, then I think you have to confront that problem both in terms of the individual's desire to retire at those levels, or society's ability to pay more in taxes to make it possible for them to exercise that as an option. We're approaching the time, if the demographics don't change, if the age composition doesn't change, that in less than 50 years there'll be 1 active worker supporting 2 on retirement. And just stop and think for a moment what that does to your paycheck.
Beverly Bemis.
Our understanding from the media, Senator McClure, is that you have drafted 4 amendments to President Carter's proposed Panama Canal Treaty. Would you explain these and your reservations concerning the treaty?
There are 2 different ways in which we can deal with the treaty. One is by reservation and the other is by direct amendment of the text of the treaty. And I have some constitutional lawyers working on the exact form of these amendments. We didn't have the language of the treaty until the day before it was signed. So we have some of the statements I made are predicated upon what press reports say are in the treaty, and we have to then try to conform that to what I'm concerned with. My basic concern with the Panama Canal Treaty is the fact that it compromises the security of the United States. We bought the canal, we paid for it, it's ours, and I recognize that argument. It's valid. I don't like to be pushed around by a small dictator. That argument is valid too. But the thing that concerns me most is what does this treaty do to the security of the United States? And I think it compromises the security of the United States, at least for the foreseeable future. The shipping through that canal is absolutely essential to our ability to mobilize the industrial capacity of this country in the event of a war. It isn't just the movement of United States Navy ships, and that's very important, but it's not just that. The total movement of goods, finished products, raw materials from coast to coast in this country is absolutely essential to our security. And the Panama Canal is a vital link in that transportation, and therefore I don't think we can afford to take the chance that we lose control. And so the first of my reservations deals with that. It says simply the treaty's null and void if the country falls under communist control. We can't afford that. The second reservation says what I think the treaty does not make clear, and that is that the location, the composition, and the disposition of U.S. forces in the canal area must be totally within the discretion of the United States. If we don't have that discretion, we cannot do what is necessary to defend the security of the canal. The third one deals with something that President Carter has said is important to this country, and one in which I agree with him, and that is the issue of human rights. We've held up the standard for the rest of the world to look at, not to tell people how to run their affairs in their countries, but a standard against which it can be measured in world opinion. human rights. Do countries comply with basic human rights, or do they abuse them? Now, aside from the issue that this dictatorship in Panama is one of the worst in the world as far as respecting human rights is concerned, we ought to be holding it up as a standard in this treaty. And we ought to say that they will comply with, they should comply with, basic human rights, as we've been saying other countries should, recognizing that General Torrijos has been a despot. There's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of press, absolute suppression of political opposition. And I think we should not be turning over people in the Canal Zone to being ruled by that kind of a government without at least raising the issue. And the final one, with mixed reasons, I want this treaty to be subjected to ratification by a vote of the people of the United States. Even General Torrijos in Panama, a dictatorship, says he's going to do that with his own people. Until the Panamanian people accept it, it won't be effective. Why can't we, in a free country, have the same opportunity to vote on that treaty as do those people that live in a far less free country? So I know there are some constitutional lawyers who tell me, oh, you can't do that. The Constitution says that the Senate must give its consent. But there's ample precedent for the granting of consent upon certain conditions. And I think one of the conditions ought to be that the American people have a chance to vote on it. Besides that, I think if they did, they'd turn it down. I have a lot more confidence in that than I have in the United States Senate. Barry Sheeler.
Senator McClure, I'm going to ask a question now in my own area of concern, which is higher education and the federal assistance programs for higher education. We in the community colleges have been somewhat concerned, as you're probably aware, of the share that we're able to get of the funds that are made available under the various categorical aid programs, NSF and the HEW programs. And what's happening seems to be that some of the best funded institutions can afford to have a grants office with a grantsman who is highly proficient in securing federal assistance and can write beautiful proposals. And smaller institutions like ours, and I think we do a good job in writing our proposals, but we don't have the staff in Washington, D.C. to make the proper contacts and connections. And I'm getting concerned, and this past year has been a good example. I think we filed 3 major applications and didn't receive funding under any one of the 3. Is there a possibility that we could get to a revenue-sharing program in higher education where we would work like it is now with the cities and the counties, perhaps, where the funding is not so much a matter of annually having a fine proposal, highly developed and pursuing a lot of lobbying efforts and that sort of thing, but rather based on the population, the student enrollments, or this sort of thing? Has this been thought about, or what do you see as maybe somewhat of an answer to what I see as a growing problem with the emphasis and where the funds are being put?
Well, whether you call it revenue sharing for education or block grants in education, the concept is the same. And it has been talked about in Washington a great deal, and I support it fully. But it's very difficult to get the majority of the Congress, let alone the bureaucrats in Washington, to let loose of control of the money. That's what a great many of us were saying over the years. Wherever the money comes from comes the control. And that's been the case. I'm very sensitive to what you say, that the larger, more well-financed institutions get a larger proportion of the money. If you'll go into the National Science Foundation Grants Program and see what institutions in the United States get the bulk of the money. I've forgotten the exact figures, but I think something like 85% of the money goes to 12 institutions. And all the rest of the hundreds of institutions in the United States divide up the balance of the 15%. And that's wrong in my judgment. First of all, it's wrong because not all the expertise is focused in the large, well-financed institutions, but I think it does something to educational opportunity in this country as well. And so I'm very much opposed to what we have been doing and very much in support of the idea of a revenue sharing for education. Take all of the money we put into education and make it available without restriction as to how it will be spent. I'll give a couple of examples which I think tell my concern. If you'll remember back to the days when the Russians launched the first satellite, and in the post-Sputnik area, we immediately said science education. So if anybody could put together a grant application for science, they got the money. But if it was for the arts or humanities or basic education, there was no money for that. During that period of time, I was in the state legislature, and our crying need on general education was getting teacher salaries up. We were scrambling. If you remember the old patch and scratch tax systems, and we were trying to get the level of educational support up because teachers' salaries were what we needed worst. At that period of time, the Boise School District, which also happens to be one of the best financed in the state, made an application for a science grant for a planetarium, and they got it. Now, I'm not opposed to a planetarium, but that was not the highest educational need in Idaho at that time. Had we had the opportunity in Idaho to take the amount of money that the federal government was putting into education, we'd have put it into teachers' salaries. I think we can do that much better at the local level than they'll ever do it in the Office of Education in HEW, 2,500 miles away. And I am very much in favor of putting these together in, whether it's, again, whether you call it a block grant or whether you call it revenue sharing for education. I'm very much in support of it. I've been out speaking around the country since 1968 on that subject because I'm very much in favor of it.
Senator McClure, another very heated issue at the time of the taping of this program on September the 10th is the director of the OMB, Stuart Lance, and I would like to get your position as to whether you think the issue is a legitimate one. Has he just had poor management, or has there been a violation of the law, and do you think he should remain in office?
First, I've already said, and I'll say it again, that I think he ought to resign. I think he has violated the standards of honesty which we have a right to expect. And I'm not just talking about what he has done in the past. I'm also talking about what he and President Carter have done in revealing his business transactions and what they've known about his business transactions. President Carter is as guilty as Lance is of covering up the true facts of Lance's financial background and dealings. Covering it up in the relationships with the Senate, attempting to cover it up when it was brought out, and I think because of that, Lance certainly should go, but I think it also says something about the willingness of the President of the United States to have his people and himself conform to the standards that he says he expects of other people. Lance is a very close personal friend. There's family relationships as well as political and friendship and business relationships. And I think it's very embarrassing to him to have this brought up, but I think he knew it all along. I don't think there's any doubt, there's no doubt in my mind that the President knew what Lance had done. Now, are there violations of the law? My understanding is that there are violations of the law. I think for the President to say, well, all bankers do this, is a slander on all bankers. It's a slander of the banking system. And the bankers are responding, at least here in Idaho. I've had a number of them say, don't tar us with that brush. That isn't the way we've conducted our business. And I think Mr. Lance will go. As a matter of fact, if you want to write down a date just for fun, mark down the calendar September 15.
Bob Brown.
Attorney General Wayne Kidwell recently charged that two of Idaho's biggest corporations, Boise Cascade and Simplot, were trying to buy the governor's chair by each backing a different candidate in the Republican primary. How much do you think that providing this ammunition to the Democrats will hurt either Butch Otter or Larry Jackson if they are the nominees for the Republicans against John Evans?
Well, unfortunately, the people of the country have been conditioned to expect graft and corruption and political influence as a way of life within the political system. And I don't think it exists as much as some think, but I do think it ought to be exposed where it does. I don't believe that the charge that Wayne Kidwell made was accurate. As a matter of fact, my own personal conviction was that Wayne Kidwell was odds-on winner in the Republican primary and very likely to win the governorship. But he, by his statements, has removed that possibility. And I think it does damage the entire political process. because it conditions people to believe, aha, there's another fellow who says it's corrupt. He's right. Because he's done that, it will hurt all candidates. The public level of cynicism and suspicion is raised. But I think it does, in particular, hurt the two candidates who were named by him, perhaps more than others, and I think unfairly so. But that's the nature of politics. He's made the charge, and it's very difficult to refute.
Beverly Bemis.
We touched a little bit on inflation. Do you see wage and price controls as a serious possibility? What direction are we headed? How are we going to control this?
Gets back a little bit to the question about the economic philosophy of this administration. I view the President Carter's statement about wanting standby wage and price controls as part of the psychological warfare that goes on in the management of the nation's business. But because I have down deep the feeling that the President, Secretary of the Treasury Blumenthal, Budget Director Lance, Charlie Schultz, the Council of Economic Advisors, all are opposed to wage and price controls, basically. So I think they may be just trying to do a little jawboning to people who otherwise might escalate prices or wages. And the other side of it, though, and it's worrisome to me, is that I think intelligent men must look at the economic situation in this country today and the game plan that the Democrats have erected to fight the problems of the economy, and recognize that inflation is going to be a major, major problem for our country. And against that backdrop, they might do some things in the field of wage and price controls that they didn't wish to do. Just as I believe President Nixon and his people were fundamentally opposed to wage and price controls, but did impose them. They imposed them because they saw a massive outflow of capital that just ballooned enormously in the billions of dollars per day flowing outside the United States in the face of an economic softness in this country. And the President reacted to that by imposing wage and price controls. We're still paying the economic consequences of what I think was an erroneous step at that time. I did not support it then. I did not support it since. I do not support it now, and I hope that they will not do it. But I think it's not outside the realm of possibility in another couple of years. President Carter undoubtedly will want to run for re-election. And he's going to be facing an economic condition in this country that is less than completely favorable to his success. Wage and price controls do not work in the long run, but they can look like they're working in the short run. And he might, just before the election, in order to cope with that problem of inflation, tell the people he's got another answer for them, and that'll be government intervention.
Barry Schuler.
I'd like to ask a question about the so-called Korean influence scandal. I have not been getting enough information to really fully understand this. I have two parts to this question. One, do you think it is wise for us to pursue this the way we are because of the possibility of straining our relations with an important ally? And secondly, why are we getting seemingly so little information about names and who the allegations are being made against? When I recall during Watergate, the press promptly brought us up to date on who did what to whom and what was involved, and we're not getting the same kind of information. Could you comment on those two parts?
Well, first of all, I've never been to Korea. So I haven't participated if, as a matter of fact, there was anything wrong in people going to Korea. I think there is a problem about the ability of Congress to investigate itself. It does a great job investigating other people. But when it's members of Congress itself, it's somehow very much more difficult to get them to look critically at what's going on. And I think that kind of an investigation, certainly, the majority of those who were involved in whatever went on, and I'm not sure that I know what went on, but whatever went on, the majority were Democrats. So the law of averages, for a couple of reasons. There are a lot more Democrats in the Congress than there are Republicans. So if all they were doing was seeking out a spectrum, they'd catch more Democrats than Republicans. And secondly, if indeed there was a conspiracy to channel money through a private businessman to make it look like it was not government money, which is a violation of the law, but getting it from an individual is not a violation of the law, they would naturally seek out those who are most influential on policy. And those people who are most influential are Democrats. So the scuttlebutt around Washington is that it's something like 90-1 Democrats involved in the name-calling so far. And that means that the Democrats who control Congress are not very apt to want to pursue it very vigorously, and they're not. In my judgment, the investigation of this incident lags far behind the investigation that took place in Watergate. But there's another motive involved. I think there is a calculated effort to smear the government of Korea without smearing anybody in this country. Take, for example, the recent comments about Congressman Foley. Did he or didn't he make an executive phone call? Well, the Justice Department has said Congressman Foley has committed no crime. He's not under investigation for having committed any crime. And yet on the list of wrongdoing of crimes committed by Tong Sung Park is the same incident. Now, if it was a crime for Tong Sung Park to do it, how can it not be a crime for Congressman Foley to do it? Now, he has said he did not do it, and I'll take his word for it. I don't know whether he did or not. That's not the issue. The issue is, why is it a crime for one and not the other? Justice Department says Park did it, and Park's guilty, but Foley isn't. And though they say it's the same thing was done. Well, maybe they say Park tried to get him to do it, but Foley refused. But if that's what they're saying, they haven't said it very clearly. So I think that there is a tendency to try to discredit the South Korean government to condition the people of this country for the abandonment of that country to communism. And that may be the major motivation behind the continuing press inquiry. But I would say this, the press, by and large, has done a pretty good job of keeping this alive, just as they have in the Burt Lance case. If it were not for the press, we wouldn't be as far along as we are on both of those investigations.
Senator McClure, another major issue for this country, and has been since the U.S. Supreme Court became involved over the question of abortion and declared, of course, that in their decision that abortion under a number of conditions was legal. The Congress has moved into the field by cutting off federal funds in the future for abortions. And this has brought another aspect to the problem before the American people, and that is, does this not put us back in a situation where women who are from wealthy backgrounds can continue to have abortions, but the poor cannot? How do we resolve this problem that we have between the poor and middle income or the rich?
Tony, this whole question is troubling to me. Troubling because I'm not sure how I feel about it in my own mind. The whole issue of abortion. Because I have found it troublesome to me, I found it very difficult to try to formulate public policy that imposes my views on somebody else. What is public policy? What should it be? The more I've had to think about the question, the more I've been inevitably pushed towards the side that says taking of life is wrong, and how, which I think we would all confess is true, taking of a life is wrong. Then the question is, when does life begin, and where do you draw the line? I don't care how you try to define that, you have real, logical, personal, moral difficulty in drawing a line. And the harder I analyze that question, the more I come to the conclusion that you can't draw the line. It's impossible to. And if you can't draw the line at 2 months or 3 months or 4 months or 5 months or 6 months or 7 months or 8 months or 9 months, where do you draw it? The more I'm impelled in my own mind to say it's impossible, and therefore abortion, except to save the life of the mother or possibly in the event of rape or incest, is an immoral thing to do. That's a personal conviction. Then how do we impose that upon other people? Well, at least we can avoid imposing that decision by supporting it financially at the federal level. And I recognize that leaves a disparity of options in the hands of those who can afford it. But that's where I've come to in my own mind after after months of agonizing over the question.
Bob Brand.
Senator, you engaged in a little crystal ball looking earlier concerning Lance's possible resignation. I'd like to look a little bit deeper now, and we're going to go into next year. Who do you think will be your Democratic opponent in next year's election?
Well, I don't know. Of course, a lot of people were saying Cecil Andrus would be my opponent, and I've always thought that was likely to be true, because certainly the Democrats are going to want to field the strongest possible candidate against me, and I think he was that possibility. I am much more likely to believe that he won't run since his wife has said he won't. That may be the most accurate political barometer anybody can get. If it is not he, there'll be someone, but very frankly, I don't know who it will be. I've heard a number of names. I am certain of only one thing, and that is there will be opposition, and that opposition will be tough and be well-financed and well-coordinated effort. And if I'm going to run for re-election and win, it'll take a good effort on my part.
Beverly Beeman.
Senator, do you have alternatives you'd be willing to share with us concerning the President's energy plan?
You know, it's difficult in a few minutes to discuss something as complex as the energy plan. There's one thing in the President's energy plan that I applaud, and that is he says it's a crisis. I couldn't get President Ford or President Nixon to say that, and I started in trying to get them to say it 7 or 8 years ago. But as late as 1975, it was impossible to get the administration to say there was a crisis. They say a serious problem perhaps, but not a crisis. And I think the President has correctly identified it as a crisis, and I applaud that. It's helpful to have it brought forth in those terms. But the President called it the moral equivalent of war, and I think this is the first time I can ever remember a President of the United States declaring war and surrendering in the same sentence. Because the energy message was a surrender. It has nothing about solving the problem except to spread the misery around a little and to raise our taxes. And it does an awful lot on how we spread the shortage or limit consumption. It does very little on how we make certain that we have enough energy to meet the absolutely vital needs of a growing dynamic society. And so, in a nutshell, I would concentrate more on how to achieve the levels of energy sufficiency which this country needs, rather than saying we can't do it, therefore we must surrender.
Barry Schuller.
Senator, what do you see as the future of the conservative bloc in Congress? Do you think they will regain strength in the next few years, or do you foresee a continuation of a trend to growing domination of liberal voices?
I am very optimistic about the political trends in this country. I'm not that optimistic about the political mechanisms of this country. I think the mechanisms and the public perceptions are different. People are always ahead of the Congress. That's the only thing that gives me much confidence about the future. If I had to look just at the Congress of the United States, I'd be very gloomy. But if I can look at the American people and talk to them and see where they're going and their attitudes, I have a great deal of confidence about where we're headed in this country. And that means to me that the people who say, I've had enough of government, I am tired of big government, big business, big labor dominating my life. I want to have some opportunity to run my own life. I'd like to spend my own money the way I want to spend it. I don't want to follow the Galbraithian attitude that was expressed so well during the Kennedy administration that the people spend too much money on beer, let's make them drink some champagne. The people have the right to make their own choices, and I think they're going to see that their will prevails. And when they see that their will prevails, then things begin to change within the Congress of the United States. And I think we have that opportunity to see a real dramatic turnaround in the Congress in the elections next year. And maybe I'm over-optimistic, but I think there will be some changes made in the directions that towards a more conservative Congress.
Senator McClure, I'm very aware that the Carter administration has not been in office long enough yet to give us a total clear picture of where they're going in all aspects of foreign policy. However, with the close touch you have by being in Congress with what's going on in Washington, what do you see at the moment as the Carter administration's relationship to both the Soviet Union and China? Are we continuing on a path of some type of both political and economic agreements and negotiations, or has there been a deterioration in relations with those countries?
Well, I think the president was right. The President Carter was right when he talked about human rights, and he said to the Russians, now you're going to have to tolerate us talking about this because we feel strongly about it. The Russians, understandably, don't like to talk about human rights because they're great violators of human rights as we see it. But I wouldn't allow myself, if I were the president or directing policy, to be deterred from saying, this is what we believe. You don't have to believe it if you don't want to, but we believe this. Because I think the people around the world still have embedded in their breast a desire for freedom. That's the strongest asset we have. And we shouldn't shy away from that because the Russians might not like it. Besides that, if they scare us into dropping the initiative, why not? Didn't cost them anything and might gain them something. So yes, I think there's a little danger that this initiative has reduced the opportunities temporarily, but not significantly in the long run. I think it may enhance them. But certainly the SALT talks, I have not all this great confidence in the SALT talks, and I wouldn't have had even if they'd sent Warnke, somebody other than Warnke, to negotiate. I wanted somebody like Barry Goldwater to go negotiate for us, and then I'd have had some confidence in the results. On Red China, I see the continuing conversation about we've got to surrender Taiwan to the Red Chinese. Why should we surrender people who've been our friends to people who've been our enemies in order to buy favor with our enemies? The enemies in everything that we stand for in this world, individually and as a nation. Now, I see the Carter administration, if they react, as I'm afraid they may, succumbing to the State Department blandishments that the way to get along with your enemies is to reward them. And you can afford to kick your friends. And that I see as a growing tendency in foreign policy in this country. And I think the rest of the world is beginning to see it. If you want to get ahead in the world, then don't be a friend of the United States. Because nobody else will respect you for being a friend of the United States, and the United States will reward you more if you're their enemy than if you're their friend. So be their enemy. It's more profitable. And you can look at that throughout the entire world. See the countries that have been on our side, see the countries that have been opposed to us, and see where our foreign policy favors or assists those nations. I think so far the foreign policy initiatives of the Carter administration have been a debacle, an absolute debacle. And how we recover from that and go forward is going to be very, very difficult. But I think we must. I think we must begin to reestablish some respect for the United States in the world. And that respect does not come from going around with pious blathering all over the country.
Bob Brown.
I'd like to turn again to next year's political races. There's a lot of speculation that several Republicans, like Barry Croft and various people, are planning on running against George Hanson within the Republican primary on the theory that apparently they think that he's in trouble and they want to keep that seat. I've heard some talk in Coeur d'Alene, this area, in the last several weeks, some speculation perhaps that Congressman Steve Sims might do the same thing, file for the Senate seat in the Republican primary. Would you care to comment on that prospect? Or?
No, I don't think he's going to file against me. Steve and I are good friends, and I have no hesitancy at all in saying he's not going to run for the Senate in the Republican primary next year.
So put that to rest, huh?
Mm-hmm. That's one political rumor I think we can safely squelch.
All right.
Beverly Bean.
Senator, there's within the Internal Revenue Service, I'm not even sure I know how to ask the question properly. It concerns capital gains and your holdings in relation to timber and land. I don't understand the question I'm asking, but maybe you can help me.
Well, I may be missing the mark, but I suspect what you're referring to is the talk of revising the tax system dealing with capital gains.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think there may be some need to revise it, but I'm not sure that it needs to be a wholesale destruction of the capital gains structure. What do you do for instance, a farm family who's lived on low income over the years? The only thing that they really accumulated for their retirement is the increased value of their land. And they suddenly sell it all in 1 year. That accumulation that they've had over a lifetime is taxed as over ordinary income in 1 year if you don't have some kind of a capital gains structure that allows them to spread that accumulation over all the years in which it actually accumulated. But it's recognized only when they actually sell it. So I think there needs to be a recognition of that principle, and there must be, or you'll destroy the incentive for a lot of these folks to stay with it. What else do they have to look forward to? But on the other hand, I think every time you use the tax system to try to accomplish something other than getting revenue, then you end up rewarding some people and penalizing some others. And so I'm always willing to take a look at the tax system and the so-called loopholes. Incidentally, I get amused at some of my Democratic colleagues in the Senate who are always talking about, let's plug those loopholes. Well, they ought to know where they are. They build every one of them.
Very sure.
Senator, you have taken an active interest in the Middle East and its problems. Do you see any help coming in that area, any resolution of the serious problems that are apparent there in the next few years?
Well, we'd better hope that there is, because if there is no movement towards peace, there will be a movement towards war. It isn't going to just stay on dead center. And a war in the Middle East that would interrupt the flow of oil to the Western industrialized world would just be absolutely devastating to us. We can't afford to take that chance. We're some 40% or better dependent upon foreign oil now for our domestic oil needs in the United States, and a high percentage of that comes from the Middle East. And we can survive. Wouldn't be easy, but we could survive an interruption of that oil. I mean, you remember the queuing up in the gasoline lines we had in the January and February of 1974? Well, that'd be child's play to what would happen this time, because our dependency is greater now than it was then. But Europe and Japan are absolutely dependent upon those areas. Their economy just absolutely collapses if they don't have that energy. So there must not be a war in the Middle East. We've got to avoid it somehow. Now, with that urgency as a backdrop, it seems to me the election of a more militant, hardline government in Israel gave us the opportunity, because it might polarize opinions. But I think that opportunity has been lost, and I think we're in a more dangerous condition than we were before, particularly as we start moving towards a Geneva conference that brings the Russians back into the negotiations. And I don't think the Geneva conference is the way to go, but it looks to me like the way the State Department is pushing us.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Senator McClure, we have run out of time. On behalf of all of us at the forum, we want to express our appreciation.
Thank you.
I also express my appreciation to the panel for their outstanding questions. May I invite you to be with us again next week on this station at this time, when again we will be discussing a very significant issue. And until that time, this is your moderators, Tony Stewart, wishing you a good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.